Hey guys, it's Atlantean Vampire here. And I didn't really want to make this video, but I had like 5 or 7 people on Discord, which I mainly dwell, unfortunately, ask me about my vampiric origins, because a couple of them are astral vampires themselves, or rather self-identified psychic vampire, but whatever. And they have their own origin stories of their past lives in which they were disconnected from source, made what they were. So I guess, they were curious, you're posting all of these videos on YouTube that seem, despite their kind of scattered and sometimes just provocative nature, actually accurate compared to most videos that talk about the subject. So we're just curious, where do you come from? which dark cave did you crawl out of? Where did you come from? And so I again, I didn't want to make this video, but I thought I would make it to make certain intents very clear in terms of what I hate, and also in regards to maybe someone that is on the verge of awakening or has awakened will be one of my brothers, and maybe they'll be on their quest to figure out what it means to be what they are, and they find this video and they're like, holy fuck, that's my brother. So that's what I'm hoping for. It's a little naive and optimistic, but I figured, why not? And in the spirit of that, in the spirit of the Shambhalan Agarthan War, of which my brothers took part of, I had the logo I used for this channel redesigned on commission, in a way that represents what we went through. And even though I was dead at the time, I was there. We're all linked, all of my brothers. We were all kind of linked to where I remember past lives that aren't my own. I remember aspects of their past lives back in that time, that desolate, awful time. And it was like I was there with them in spirit and experienced their same conviction, their same joys and fears and hatreds. And they're the reason I have a deep hatred for monkeys, right? Just those little fuckers, right? I hate them so much. I watched The Wizard of Oz, and I'm like, oh, those little fuckers. So yeah. This is going to be a really weird video, but I don't care how out there it sounds. But hold on. But yeah, my story started around, I thought it was much older, but I got the die-off event mixed up, around 66 million years ago. I believe that's the right die-off, the one where that meteorite striked and killed off the dinosaurs. I got that mistaken for another one that was like 262 million years ago or something like that. But anyways, yeah, around like 66 million years ago, there was a super advanced alien civilization, ancestral civilization, in the Eye of Taurus, known as Aldebaran. These people Germans, Northern Europeans, Scandinavians, look very similar to them, except they're not mammals. Their women don't have pain during childbirth. Here's like a diagram of how tall they are. They're sexually dimorphic. The men are in charge of martial military affairs, and the women that of the temples. And since it's a rather theocratic society, they are matriarchal by their nature. Yeah, if that makes sense. And yeah, they how do I put this? Mainly breathed nitrogen and then oxygen secondarily, and they had blue blood due to a copper compound instead of iron. Yeah, basically if you were to put it in simple terms, were sun worshippers, but they didn't really worship the sun. The sun was a metaphor for Brahman, or the monad. The undivided sun is what they called their focal point of worship. Similar to the Hindu conception of the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer. The one ultimate all-knowing God that is also indifferent, this pantheistic solar conception. Their society was socially right-wing, and their economics were, well, very left-wing. Very, communist in some ways, I suppose. Like how do I put it? They had no real money. They evolved past that. But yeah, a lot of their not banks. They didn't really have banks, but basically their public transports, their healthcare, their education, like all of that was free. And socially, they valued their traditions, they value their race, their biology, and you could say that their spirituality, their tradition, was this mix between a type of solar pantheism and a biological racial worldview, very similar to Dr. William Luther Pierce's conception of cosmotheism. You couldn't really call them pagan or Abrahamic or whatever. Like, they weren't monotheistic and they weren't polytheistic. And you could call them transhumanistic in certain regards, in terms of them intentionally, with eugenics and all of that, selective breeding, but also with intentional genetic modification, very similar within their society to the notion of the movie Gattaca, if that makes sense. They ruled the Milky Way during their time with two other races, a race called the Aviaries, which I believe inspired some of the Egyptian gods, and another one called the Nagas. The Nagas were snake people that were vegetarian, they're still around, that are vegetarian, that are very peaceful and have a very kind of solar pantheistic society, and you could call their societal structure National Socialist, just like the Aldebarans and all of that, and the Aviaries. And, the Naga, I believe, had contact with Earth at some point, just as the Aviaries did, but this focus is more on the Aldebarans. The Aldebarans consumed raw flesh, blood, organs, bone marrow, tendons, all of that. And these three races, basically, this is where I get my notion of how I worship. They recognize the world tree in its totality as a living organism, and the point of greater realms, greater dimensions that contain their mercurial, their astral, and their material, their sulfur, salt, and mercury. They acknowledge that these bulbs, these protrusions on the end of the tree, exist for the sake of, like growing and then breaking off and becoming new cosmic trees to the dark forest. And you could say that they believe the point of life is to germinate these seeds. It's to grow so it's ready to fall off the tree, so to speak. So they have like a mantle of responsibility, similar to the halos from Forerunner, or the the Forerunners from Halo. This is a really great start. Derp. But they have a mantle of responsibility similar to the Forerunners from Halo. And just this philosophy, they call it Arianism, which I believe that's where ancient Vedics and modern ideological fanatics got it from. But it was basically this path of nobility. Kind of think like something like an esoteric path towards what is most societally and cosmically productive, kind of like the golden path from Dune, so to speak, in which they believe that every species could participate in this practice, and every race or ethnicity within said species could, and that there were Aryan or noble amongst every group, but that some noble forms were better than other noble forms. Like, there is the Indian elephant, which is not as noble as the African elephant or whatever. You could say the Indian elephant is a downgrade, right? But even then, amongst cockroaches, there are noble cockroaches, and then there are lesser cockroaches. But still, the Indian elephant is above the cockroach, regardless of how noble a cockroach can be, if that makes sense. And that's kind of how they viewed it, as not this universal, perennial pantheistic view where, we're all a part of the same thing, and we all live together and we're all striving towards self-actualization and things like that. They believe that it was the right of certain species that have overcome lesser versions of their own species. Yes, there were different races and ethnicities of Aldebarans. They all killed them off. They're extinct. But so the ones we're talking about are the ones that kind of won, kind of like how the Viltrumites killed half of their population in order to create the Viltrum Empire in Invincible. But they'd been, for thousands of years, the same kind of homogenous group. And basically they believed that it was their right to, seed the Milky Way and then Andromeda and then every other galaxy in succession with life, to elevate species that already existed to their level of civilization, and to also create new species, because they believe that once they fertilized the entire third dimension, they could move on to the fourth and the fifth and so on and so forth. And then Midgard would become so brimming full of life that Midgard could break off from the tree and then go into the salty waters below, and all life could be absorbed in like egg yolk for the embryo, and the baby could hatch from the egg, so to speak. Which you could say that's cosmic suicide. I don't think so. I call it cosmic birth. Cosmic suicide is the Order of the Nine Angles. But I digress. I digress. The point is, they believed in the sanctity of life, and you might be like, oh, well, they eat raw meat. Yeah, I mean, you like. They have a right to exist too. But the thing is, they had an interesting policy on their planets, where when it came to like in order to keep like the most noble of their prey species noble, strong, impressive, they would always kill the weakest, like their alien equivalent of deer. They'd kill the runts and those that were just would have been killed off by their own kind, because it's just enough to feed your family. They didn't trophy hunt. They used every part of the animal, and they would intentionally like have it so the strongest and best in nature could grow and become strong. And then they'd wait a certain amount of generations and then kill a gigantic big one once they knew the genes of that specific proportion and strength was secured in the rest of the ecosystem. And that would be a communal effort. They would killing such a big impressive thing would bring glory to the hunter, the male hunter that killed it. It would honor his family, but also at the same time, it was for the community. It wasn't for himself. To kill such a big thing and be like, this is mine. I did this, so I should keep it, is something that would have been unconscionable in Aldebaran society. They basically had a lifespan where they could live up to like 500, 600 years. They had technology to keep themselves immortal. Some, if they were working on a really advanced science project, they could keep themselves alive for like 5,000, 10,000 years. But despite having the technology to be immortal, they understood the nature of everything, and they enjoyed dying as much as they did living, and they wouldn't rob themselves of the opportunity to die naturally, either in battle or at their bedside surrounded by their loved ones. So oftentimes they would choose to have their lifespan end despite having all of the means to continue to be immortal, because they believed that death was sacred, and they had no desire to perpetually live. Their immortality, despite having the means for more literal immortality, they believed to partake in the character of immortality was to leave a legacy worth inheriting, so to speak. And that was kind of their philosophy. And they didn't have TV shows or anything like that. They didn't have video games. They believed in going to playwrights, orchestras, things like that. And when I asked a dead Aldebaran spirit. Why? They said that so there's certain forms of communalism and entertainment that are very real and allow one to get a feel for what living actually is, and living besides those you love, and a type of entertainment that sharpens the mind. Whereas there is some forms of entertainment that, while you could say digitally it's communal, it's just a disconnect between those you love and care about, in a form of self-isolation, in which TV shows and movies and orchestra or video games, they not orchestra video games would rot your brain. It would make you dull, and they believed in making themselves as individuals sharp so that the collective godhead would be sharper, if that makes sense. Yeah, they didn't put a lot of stock in individuality, and they believed that the most important thing was the national community. And their whole thing was about honor. They were generally disgusted by material things. Oh, someone messaged me. Yeah, they were generally disgusted by material possessions, and they had a very Hellenistic type of culture, which I personally believe that what was the first example of Hellenistic, was it like, I think there was an older one before Greece. Was it the Phoenicians? Either way, I believe that we got Hellenistic architecture as kind of a leftover from Atlantean survivors. We'll get to that, but no, they're very interesting people, very strong people. And it's interesting because, according to Inosis, they'll terraform planets that were previously uninhabitable, and they'll fill them with life, and they'll create like hunting game preserve planets, and what could be described in 40K terms as death worlds. And they would get their children, their sons, and they'd leave them on the planet, very similar to a Spartan ritual, where this little kid would, kill this monster and bring back its heart, drink its blood from the heart, and bring it back to its father and mother. And the daughters were usually raised to hone in their psychic abilities and taught multiple forms of language, diplomacy, because the women were in charge of the government. So they were kind of groomed for the monarchy type of position. There was one empress, and and it was weird because they're like, the only way to, like, there were low level male politicians, but there were politicians in like the military sector, you could say. And they were always veterans. They always had a background as generals. And the women that were in what would be our equivalent of modern day politics were more, it was like, if the only way to run for Senate was if you were a priestess and formally educated in politics, so to speak, within party ideology and purity. The daughters would be basically raised to govern and dictate what the Aldebarans would do with their empire, and the boys were sent off to fight and kill, which that's actually pretty, I'm kind of jealous. But anyways, like they were very balanced. They represented this perfect ideal of male and female. And unlike our society, where we constantly undermine women's psychic and magical abilities, and women constantly emasculate us and try to take away from the sanctity of our violence and our just lower empathy kind of mode of protecting, killing, hunting, just like, where basically neither one nags at each other, where like they understand their places, they understand what they're strong in and what they're weak in, and they elevate each other and they build each other up, and they're perfect. I can't even describe it. They're perfect, It's like, yes, allow me to be the barbarian I am, allow me to be the killer that I am, absolutely, But only men were allowed in the military, and they had all sorts of units, all sorts of legions, which were, my favorite, and I'll have to commission someone to make it, was this type of power armor that it looks very similar to somewhere between a Space Marine and like T-51 power armor, I think it is, from Fallout. But their helmet was basically a giant minotaur head, like a metal minotaur head with like a gas mask, if that makes sense. And it was another thing they had. Basically, to them, the animal that represented them, they wanted to they created something that was like a semi-organic creature, to heighten and strengthen their psychic abilities. This animal, that they viewed as sacred, was not a cow. Cows are completely different than what these were, but the creation of the cow was definitely involved with this. But basically, they thought, okay, if we were to create a creature that by every proportion of its body, its organs, what it's capable of, the way its emotional state is, if we were to like combine all of that as a giant metaphor for how we viewed God, what would it look like? And it was basically a cow, right? So while they would eat flesh and stuff like that, and literally they'd get different alien predators from different planets and combine their genetics and create outrageously fucked up species to hunt and eat, some father-son activities, and they would not eat their equivalent of cows. Absolutely not. That was like they would be put to death for that. They absolutely hated such notions yeah, no. And it's funny because the soldiers, I imagine like a futuristic version of Greek hoplite armor, and their civilians, their men and women, would always wear like a white type of toga. And they had this weird material that I just call white gold, but it's basically the same thing as elephant ivory, but it has like a metallic element to it. Like it's something that they can, that has like a metallic root, so to speak. I'm not like it, like I don't, it took me a long time to figure it out, but the way I think it is that calcium is a metal, and calcium can, turn to things like ivory and all that. I think what happened was they had like some type of animal in their prehistory that had produced a form of ivory, but instead of using like as a part of its biology, utilizing calcium metal in the development of its like ivory and bones, it developed, it used actual gold and somehow developed ivory with gold as its like base, like mineral metal, so to speak. And I think they figured out how to synthetically recreate it, and that became like one of their most valuable things in terms of aesthetics and like wedding gifts and things like that. That was another thing. They were monogamistic, and their men and women, if a partner died, they wouldn't remarry. They would just like wait till they died, whether it's man or woman. They only, in their society, they only allowed virgins to marry each other. Those that had premarital sex, I want to say, were castrated or something like that, or chemically castrated, as they believed in keeping the line of succession, valid. And they had patrilineal last names that corresponded to their military houses. They had military houses that were kind of like surnames, or whatever, that were passed down from like father to son to daughter, and then daughter would take on her husband's thing. But since they were also matriarchal in terms of theology in their temple type of society, there was matrilineal houses that basically represented the succession of priestesses and those amongst their kind of spiritual covenant, so to speak. And basically the husbands would take on the feminine name or whatever of their wife, designated him as married to this person in position of a certain rank within their faith. Yeah, if that makes sense. And so they had their own equivalents. But yeah, marriage was very important to them. And they also had like a policy where if a baby was born with one little defect, they would euthanize the baby and turn it into nutrient paste, for their animals, for like their equivalent of like dogs. If a baby was born with like their equivalent of a clubbed foot, they'd kind of just chuck it. That was kind of, it was very important to them that they saw it as doing it out of compassion, because you know, sure, they had the technology that could make any type of medical issue seem, oh, well, this is, I can live a good life in spite of this. But they believed that it was their obligation as parents to make it so there was no living in spite of, but just living with the full privilege of being healthy, like, you know, being able to just by right off the bat, without any external reliance, enjoy existence. And yeah, so they didn't believe in that. Um, and since there were really no cultural differences, religious differences, racial differences, there was no conflict, and they attributed their societal development not off of tolerance and social understanding, but out of absolute collective uniformity and just unity. And that's how they define themselves. It was, you know, just a very monolithic society, which I miss, not gonna lie. Anyways,